Ellie Portnoy is formerly of ThinkNear, recently acquired by Telenav, now runs Scout Advertising, a division of Telenav, and doing some really interesting things, but also interesting thoughts around location. We all talk about location. You know, it's a local conference and how mobile and local are coming together, and it's really just kind of evolving into a different way of thinking about location. We've talked about this a bunch. Before we go into that, tell us a little bit about Scout, about your background and your role, and then we'll talk about just kind of some of those main topics.
Sure. So Scout Advertising is the combination of ThinkNear, which was a company I founded about 2 years ago, and Telenav's advertising solutions. So Telenav is a company that's been around for about 13 years, and the company started building GPS solutions for mobile devices. So for the past 13 years, it's been collecting data and expertise around how to drive someone, how to get someone to go from point A to point B using their mobile phones. And so that's incredibly important and relevant information and insights and data that we've been collecting, and we're using all of those data and insight to power Scout Advertising, which is an end-to-end solution to help advertisers drive customers from point A to point B.
So one of your differentiators is utilizing data in a very interesting way, and not just location data. You've developed this kind of paradigm called situational targeting. So it's weather patterns, it's time of day, you know, a lot of kind of traditional triggers to target advertising, but a lot of new ones and a lot of new combinations of things. Talk a little bit about situational targeting.
Yeah. So when we started ThinkNear, what we were focused on was using location very granularly to power mobile ads. And one day, in the midst of developing the product, I was walking down New York, and I crossed 34th Street, and as I started walking down 34th Street, I saw a bunch of street vendors. And these guys had basically set up tables on the corner, and they were selling DVDs and sunglasses and a bunch of other items. And I thought that was interesting and didn't really pay any attention to it, and I kept walking, but then all of a sudden it started to rain. And as soon as the rain started dropping, they all flipped their carts over and they started selling umbrellas. And to me, that was a really powerful way to think about advertising, because what they were doing was they were saying, I know where my customers are. They're in New York City. I know what they're doing. They're walking around outside. And I know what's happening around them. It's raining. And they used those three pieces of information to sell me the perfect product, an umbrella. And I thought to myself, well, that's interesting. We're kind of doing the same thing. We know exactly where people are when we show them an ad, which means we can infer activity. We can figure out if they're in a gym or at work, if they're at home or at a bus stop. And the final thing we can do is we can start ingesting real-time data about the context of where they are, of what's happening around them. And so we started looking at weather and temperature, UV index, all of these different important factors that play a role into your real-world situation. And so we created situational targeting, which is essentially allowing advertisers to have a 360-degree view of the person when they're showing them an ad. So where are they? What are they doing? What's happening around them? So you can tailor and customize that ad and talk to them based on that real-world situation.
And what I like about this too is a piece of campaign optimization that's often ignored when we're talking about location targeting. Of course, you're talking about where and when the ad shows up based on all those variables. But another element, the creative, I think is an interesting point that people often just kind of don't pay attention to. So talk about creative too, and how that really can solidify the message you want to send at that time, and if that has any kind of performance deltas that you have observed.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was a little bit frustrating initially because we had all of this incredible data that we were helping advertisers use to target the ads, but that's sort of where that story would end. We would use this data, we would target the right person at the right time, but we would tell him the exact same story we were telling everyone else. So we realized that in order to really leverage mobile and to really make it work, you need to use all of the data at your disposal, not just to target them, but to tell a story and to message them with that data. So we built a very robust dynamic creative engine that basically takes all of the same information we're using to target and uses that to message and tell a story to the user. So, Crunch Fitness is a great example of this. We run the campaign for them year out, and when it starts to rain or when the weather turns bad or when the conditions are such that people are probably not likely to be exercising outside, that's when we really target them heavy, and that's when we change the creative and we tell them, hey, you don't have to run outside, you don't have to give up your exercise, you can come into a comfortable Crunch Fitness gym. And we've seen the results have been exponential, so I can't actually share the numbers, but we track all the way down to the call, and the number of calls that come in based on these creatives are just incredibly higher than when we use a standard creative.
Great, that's excellent. Now, this is an interesting point that I wanted to talk to you about, because we talk about location in the moment, sending an ad because of those conditions that we mentioned and location, but broadening location not just for the concept of placing an ad based on it, but tracking location over a longer period of time. So in other words, showing an ad not within a geofence where someone is now, but what were their last 30 geofences, and what does that say about them? And can we start to utilize all that data to start to profile audiences? Is that a soccer mom? Is that a college student? Is it a traveler? Stuff like that. And the reason why I think that's interesting is because there's been a slower than expected adoption of mobile advertising from the buy side, especially among national advertisers. This brings the discussion and changes the dialogue to start to speak their language, because this is something they've been doing for years, buying certain audiences, but just does it better. What else are you seeing in terms of using location beyond just the situational targeting?
Yeah, so location is so rich as a data source, because I think when location-based advertising first started to come out, everyone was thinking about them as a way to understand proximity. So I'll show you an ad because you're close to my business, or I'll show you an ad because you're close to X, Y, and Z. And so it was all about proximity and saying, hey, now we can finally tell how close someone is to a certain business. But location is so much richer than that, because it does tell you a lot about the audience, about the type of person, about who they are. So, if advertisers are looking for auto intenders, so traditionally what they would do is they would look at cookies, and they would try to figure out sort of the trail of intent that a user sort of defined online. So they went to Nissan.com, Auto Trader, maybe Edmunds, and that let them know that this person was an auto intender. Well, with location, you can do the exact same thing, only incredibly more powerfully. You can say, I want to target people who are actually in car dealerships. That is an auto intender. That is an audience. That is someone who is definitely thinking and interested in buying a car, and you can tell that based on the location. So location for ads isn't just about proximity, it's about trying to understand who the person is and trying to target a specific audience. And now when you do that and you can start looking at that trail of location, you start getting into an even more powerful way of looking at an audience based on location.
I like that too, because once you identify that device as being someone that's in market for a car, you no longer are confined to only reaching them when they're near the dealership. You already know that about them, and you can reach them wherever they go for a certain period of time. And that goes to what my colleague Rick Ducey and I are starting to call the 10% problem. It's often said that only 10% of location impressions are accurate down to the lat-long level. Others will kind of defer to other more kind of broadly defined radii. But this is great, because while you have them for that 10%, glean all the information you can, and then start to target based on that in the other 90% of the time. And that gets rid of some of the scalability challenges that location will sometimes bring about.
Right.
So let's move on. You also are doing some interesting things, with data. You guys are big on data, and similar to the previous slide where we're talking about monitoring people's behavior and using that to optimize best practices in ad targeting going forward. And you're seeing kind of behavioral differences in things like how far someone's willing to travel for certain products or within certain cities. Talk about the types of things you're looking at there and what you're finding.
Yeah, absolutely. So this all comes back to the data we're collecting as a broader company in Telenav. And the idea is we've got 13 years of experience and data on how people get to point A to point B. So it's obviously all anonymized data, but what we learned is that there's actually really, really nuanced differences in how people get from point A to point B. So the traditional way of setting up a geofence and doing a proximity-based campaign is, okay, I am Wendy's, for instance, and I'm going to target anyone who's within 3 miles of any of my locations. Well, it turns out that people travel much farther if they're in Dallas than they do if they're in Washington, D.C. It's actually about 44% more, they're willing to travel more in Dallas, and the number is something like 55% in Los Angeles versus New York. So regionally, there are massive differences in how far someone is willing to travel in that city. So, and it makes sense, it makes intuitive sense. If I'm in New York, I'm much more likely to find what I need close by, and I'm much more likely to be less inclined to drive long distances given traffic and other conditions than when I'm in somewhere like Dallas. So setting up a universal geofence just doesn't make a lot of sense. You need to understand the nuances of each specific region and set up geofences that are smart, that understand how far are people actually willing to travel to get to my business. That's how far I should set that geofence. And so, but the same is true not just for cities, it's also true for categories. So coffee shops, people are willing to travel 66% less than they do for a car dealer. That's really interesting because if you're trying to get people to come into Starbucks, you want to set much tighter geofences than if you are for your car dealership. And these are examples of ways that you can hone and create smart geofences around each of your locations, each of your businesses to optimize how many people see your impression and how effective they are, because you end up wasting less impressions if you show it to a more relevant audience of people. And so those are the types of insights that we're looking at. We're trying to understand over the last 13 years, how have people been using their phone to get from point A to point B, and how do we take that information to create smarter and smarter campaigns to drive people using mobile advertising.
And that's where, Telenav's kind of long-standing assets and kind of scale sounds like it really kind of came to bear with the synergies with, the data that you guys are putting together. That's very interesting. And really the end game in there is to, limit the wasted impressions, which is a challenge right now. That also sounds like it's very fitting to kind of chain, national organizations with lots of far spread out localized constituencies. So that's actually all the time we have before we move on to Derek. Any kind of parting words on kind of lessons that you've learned from your time in this space and the way things are so quickly changing and evolving?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. We're in an unprecedented time where all of a sudden people have devices that they're taking with them everywhere they go. And that's very different from a computer where you're sitting down and it's very obvious what people are doing when they're in front of a computer. They're in front of a computer, that's what they're doing. When you have a phone, people are actually taking it with them and using it to interact with the real world and using it across their day-to-day activities. And that is the opportunity. The opportunity is trying to understand where they are, what they're doing, what's happening around them, the situation that they're in when they're using that phone, and that's what we're trying to help advertisers do.
I think that's well said. You'll be available for the rest of the conference to answer any questions or meet with people?
Absolutely.
Great. Well, join me in thanking Ellie. Derek, you can come on up. Next, we have a similar discussion in terms of mobile ad targeting with respect to location. Derek DiCarlo's VP of Strategy at LSN Mobile, doing a lot of work with various advertisers of all sizes and some interesting takeaways and examples of what we're seeing working and not working. So let's start off by telling a lot of these individuals know you, but a little bit about yourself and LSN for those unfamiliar.
So LSN Mobile is 40 people in Atlanta, solely focused on mobile services for media. We work with broadcasters, print publishers, optimizing their content for mobile web, mobile apps, SMS services, and I lead that media group. We also have a group that is focused on mobile advertising. So we've created one of the largest mobile ad networks in the U.S., serving over 2.5 billion mobile ad impressions a month. So we get a lot of perspective both on the local and the national and best practices of what works. I've been with LSN since actually before the company founded, so I have the scars of growing through the mobile ecosystem, as it were.
What are the publishers you're working with, or the groupings of publishers that you're finding are the most adaptive or adoptive in terms of building cool things?
Well, that's a good question. There's with mobile, it's really interesting where so much of the time they're either trying to jam whatever they were doing in digital into mobile, just thinking it's a smaller screen and doing that square peg round hole thing, or they're way overthinking it. They get really deep and bogged down in the details, some of the geo, some of these things, and they forget the basics, which is step back. What is it the client's trying to accomplish? Matching up the creative to that. I cannot believe how many campaigns I see today that you still click on and it goes to their desktop site. I've had campaigns from even national guys like Chevy that have come through, and they took their large desktop banner and shunted it down to a mobile form factor. So there's some great things you can do with mobile, and certainly there's some alignment with their desktop digital efforts. But mobile is a little bit unique. It's certainly much more brevity and utility are your key factors there. And so working with those advertisers in communicating, again, those best practices. Creative is huge. People think, okay, the banner in mobile is smaller, so they tend to put less, which is good and bad.
Yeah.
Right? So if you're not conveying some call to action, people aren't going to click on it, or worse, they're going to click on it and have no idea why they did that, right?
Yeah.
So really making sure the basics are there,
Yeah.
right? And then from there, it's where do you take that experience? Again, making sure the elements are mobile appropriate. And again, using these things that are real basic, right? Brevity, so go straight to an offer, to a message. Make sure that you don't forget on where then you want to target that, so that you're going to garner the best results. So, for instance, we live in content world. So if it's a auto dealer that they're focusing on a truck special, that's a male demo they want to reach.
Sure.
So let's do some targeting in sports, right? A male audience and things like that. But again, creative, easy,
Yeah.
connect them, take advantage of the interactive functions, and don't overthink it. But at the same time, don't leave it there. I see campaigns that 3 months later, they're the same creative, the same offer. And this is all block and tackling basics.
Sure.
None of this is really remarkable. And then again, when you click on it, if you go to a desktop site, you've just broken that complete experience.
I agree, and it's interesting too. I mean, among SMBs in particular, you're dealing with probably the mid-market or larger types of advertisers, and some SMB. But the number that we get from vSplash is that 2% of SMB websites are optimized for mobile. And we're going to talk about this in the next segment, but it's kind of the carrot and the stick. The carrot is, with that optimized site, you can do a lot of, engage users that are in this kind of high buying intent mode, lower funnel mode, as we keep hearing and showing. But the stick is that, I think the stat that Google gives is 40% of the people that come to your site will leave and go to a competitor site if shown an unoptimized experience. And it's really just dropping the ball on something that is pretty simple. Right?
I deal with a lot of business owners in agencies that'll go, well, we can load the site on our iPhone.
Right.
So therefore, the experience must be appropriate.
Yeah.
And it's much like digital best practices, which is, okay, if you bring them to your main site and it's just the site, and it doesn't relate to the campaign like a coupon or an offer or some call to action,
right.
The user has no idea what to do. And in mobile, your time is short, so you just lost them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And everybody kind of thinks in the context of how they use it. Well, I can browse on my smartphone, so why not? And again, focus on that message. So if you're a plumber, we'll use that since that seems to be a relevant term
Plumber's
here.
Fine.
Relevant theme here is, their main site, they'll have a picture of their truck and talk about their services and Better Business
certification.
Bureau. Exactly, all those wonderful things. The honest plumber, the non-smelly plumber, the pink plumber, whatever. Yeah. In mobile, it's here are our services. Here's how you schedule an appointment.
Yeah.
Get right to the meat of it.
Yeah. Well, it aligns with the user intent in that situation. Mm-hmm. But and there are a couple different things there that you hit upon in terms of optimization. One is the content. Of course, the content has to be there and different than the desktop. So calls to action that are conducive to mobile surfaced higher, but then also the page rendering. So it's a UI issue and it's a content issue.
Yep.
And it's funny, you ask a lot of businesses, large and small, are you on mobile? Are you optimized for mobile? I guess it depends how you phrase it. Usually they don't understand the question and will say yes, because they think that on their iPhone they can pull up their website. But the answer is no in that case, right? So that's really an education thing.
And there's a lot of tools out there to do it. So it's not
And the barriers are coming down.
Yeah. Simplicity is key.
Yeah. Well, a lot of website hosting companies are actually kind of bundling in mobile optimization for free because it's becoming a standard. Even apps, the price to have an app is coming down, where you don't have to be Coca-Cola and have a bunch of fancy attributes to your app and spend $50,000 on it. You can have an app for a lot cheaper than that.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Probably a 3-digit sum or less. So you provided a lot of bullets here in terms of best practices. We went over actually kind of scattershot fashion a lot of these already. What other things do you want to say that you see as common mistakes in both advertising and presence?
Again, we cover it a lot here, and we've got a couple examples coming up. I think it really comes down to, there's just a few basic steps, and to address each of those, you don't have to belabor them, but good creative, target it, and create a good experience and follow through, right? And so nothing remarkable on any of that, but that's it. So we'll get great creative, and they'll run at ridiculous frequency.
Yeah.
a great offer, but they don't time it well, or little basic things like that that just kill you. And none of these things are that hard.
Yeah.
So just a little detail focus.
Let me ask you this, for an advertiser, either in-house or an agency or anyone acting on their behalf, do you recommend different teams that are different individual building the mobile campaign because perhaps there's too much habit creep that's inherent in, another digital executive kind of running that, or devising the content?
I'll answer that in a few moments.
Okay.
Let's do that with one of our examples,
okay.
and then we'll...
Fair enough.
The short answer is yes and no.
And I forgot some of these animation. This just underscores the point. There's a lot of growth there, but still so much to be had. So I'll just... I didn't know about all this animation. So yeah, this is one campaign you did for 7-Eleven. Walk us through this.
So this was 7-Eleven in Hawaii, which we all, of course, need to make a site visit to after last night's snow. In mobile, one of the things that everybody asks about is, can I display a coupon on the handset? And of course you can. The bugger there, though, is, how do you handle the redemption element? And how do you, training
challenge.
And all these facets where it's sure we can, but can the client support it?
Yep.
This particular case, they were already doing things with SKUs and had a well-trained retail force that we could display a coupon and rotate weekly offers, driving people, doing a store locator and all those things. So really keeping it to the basics. Weekly offers, and promoting that fact so they know that there's a frequency change, having the offer very prominent, where can they find the location, and then executing on that. One of the interesting things about this campaign was when we started it, one of the questions was, we want to run this just as a share of voice, general run a site kind of a thing. Mm-hmm. And I was telling them, retail in certain other categories, you don't want to do that because the user will see that ad and they may be at work or at home or wherever, and they'll see it and they'll think about it and they'll go, that's great, but they're not going to act on it yet. So when they go to the store and they're getting ready to act on it, you need to make sure they can find it. So we ran this as just kind of an ROS campaign against my suggestions, and in the first month they had 0 redemptions. 0. So we talked about let's heavy it up, let's focus you in some key areas so the users can come back and find you. So that second repeat visit, they're going to be able to connect with that offer. And immediately we had 500 redemptions the next month.
Nice.
So as much as the creative was there, the offer was there,
right.
Those little targeting things, and again, none of that is rocket science, but you can see here the performance of the campaign's been stellar, continues to be. It's been running for, I think well over a year. The client's thrilled with it. Again, they're getting all the tracking data. And if you're ever there, that you can get, slushies or different BOGOs. And their favorite one is, and I'm going to say the word wrong, but it's the bloody Spam on rice thing that looks like sushi, but it's Spam. Anyway,
I have no
somebody
idea.
out there I'm sure knows the word, but I always get it wrong. But anyway, that's their favorite one to rotate through. But this has been a fun campaign and been very effective.
Yeah, high redemption rate, high CTR too. I mean,
Yep.
For the audience benefit, how does that compare in CTR terms to, campaigns where you're not doing the same level of location targeting or other creative, all the things you're espousing?
Yeah, so we talk about 3 to 5 times increase in CTRs in mobile versus desktop.
Yep.
Some of that's just the unique nature of mobile.
Yeah.
Even if you cancel out, you take into consideration some of the misclicks, which we're doing a lot of things to counter that, so we get quality clicks. It's still a high level of engagement, and the conversion rates, just like the folks from MarchX and others were saying, we're seeing 20% conversion rates easily.
It's almost like the CTR isn't as important anymore. It's what comes after the click. Right?
Exactly. Post-click behavior is huge. A lot of targeting elements doing that. We're getting a lot of campaigns related to, especially in the app space, install open rates and things like that.
Sure, app installs. So let's move on for the sake of time here. And I apologize about this animation. Another case study that you worked on. Walk us through this.
So this was, Mike had asked the question about, should you have different mobile teams versus your other advertising teams? This was a medical center in Greenville, South Carolina. Great local brand. Did some very specialized things in the medical space. And so they were doing mobile advertising. The top element you can see there was their initial creative, says direct connect to HRC now. Click to call. And it went to a page that talked about just general stuff, and they were talking about hormone replacement theory, but really didn't have a lot of detail to it. And the client was really upset because they weren't getting calls, they weren't getting the engagement they wanted. And this goes back to the conversation of what are you trying to achieve? What are you doing in other channels?
Yeah.
So I did a very simple web search and found in other markets where this particular group was, the creative was more specific. So that's the second element you see that says, hey, natural hormone replacement specialist, click here for more info. And that combined with adjusting some of the creative around the brand they were doing. And then the other was they were saying, I said, what works for you? And they said video testimonials.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's put video testimonials in the mobile. So they gave me a whole slew of them. We created a video library. And the engagement levels just went through the roof. I don't have quite the same data we did from 7-Eleven.
Sure.
But the net result was the client was thrilled. We saw more engagement. And it was more specific. So again, that creative is important. The targeting is important. The follow-through being important. What are you doing? So even though it's mobile, there are some things you want to do differently. You want to be brief. You want to consider the utility element. But at the same time, consistency in message. What works for you in your traditional digital? What works for you in your traditional media? I can't believe I say traditional digital, but anyway.
Right.
What's working in your other channels, and let's execute around that.
It's interesting too. There's a certain amount of that can be packaged up as best practices, but there's a certain percentage of your overall strategy that has to be reserved for just like this video testimonials. It makes sense because it's a category for which gaining trust is probably a big objective.
Huge.
So yeah, I mean it's just really kind of a lot of situational strategy development, but of course working with a baseline of kind of best practices, and I think you've outlined those well. So we need to move on to Shuki, but any last thoughts about any of the above or anything to reiterate?
So let me clarify. I think we've talked about some of these, how to manage these and make adjustments, right? So this execution here, this adjustment was an hour of my time, followed by a half-hour phone call.
Right.
So we're not talking months and months of protracted analysis. It's just kind of straight to it and go.
Excellent. Well, please join me in thanking Derek